Last summer, I recorded a debate with biblical scholar David Lamb that was hosted by the Analytic Christian, and it just was posted online in the last couple days. We were talking about a couple passages in Deuteronomy and the question of whether there is the danger that they are providing a legislative framework that would allow for sexual assault. And it was a very good discussion. I'm going to link it below. Definitely check the whole thing out. In this video, I wanted to interact with one comment that a person made, which I think is extremely dangerous. But first, I'm going to just begin by reading the first passage we discussed, talk about how I responded, and then we'll take a look at that commenter. So the passage comes from Deuteronomy 21. I'm going to read from verse 10 to 13. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes that she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be your husband, and she will be your wife. Now, when David talked about that passage, I'm going to just summarize here. Again, watch the whole debate below, that I'll link it below. But David was saying, well, maybe it's not the most perfect situation, but, we don't understand it as much. We don't have this experience of like war orphans and war brides and so on in Western culture. But within that culture, that was in the ancient Near East, that was the best thing for her. And she got a month to mourn, which is relatively a long time, etc. And so my response was to say, if we're going to talk about this passage within the context of the potential for it being linked to rape, sexual assault, we have to have a concept of sexual consent, right? You have to conceptually define what is sexual consent, and then we can talk about whether this sets up conditions that would allow for rape. So I defined sexual consent, and I said the way I'm going to define it is the way it is commonly defined in North American law, which is, I think, a very good definition. And it's three parts. The first part is for sexual consent to obtain, a person must be able to consent. So they must be of the age of consent, which can vary depending on region. In some areas, it's 16, in some areas, it may be 18. It can vary, but you have to be able to consent. The second, but I should say much more about that. Sorry. So consent is not only that you reach a threshold age, you must have the mental capacity to consent. Um, you also must not be under the influence of drugs or alcohol that would undermine your ability to consent. And there also can't be power relationships present, which may undermine your ability to consent. And some of those power relationships would be, for example, uh, potentially doctor-patient relationship. If a doctor initiates sexual contact with a patient, even if the patient ostensibly consents, there may be a power relationship there that undercuts the patient's very ability to freely consent, and thus it could be sexual assault. Another example of the power relationship would be a captor who killed the person's family and kidnapped them. That person could now not freely sexually consent because they were traumatized by the person who killed their family and kidnapped them. That's not complicated. That's not that hard. I think that's pretty straightforward. Two other factors that are also involved in consent. First is that consent has to be ongoing, or sorry, let's just say, first of all, it has to be enthusiastic, and third, it has to be ongoing. So there has to be continued evidence of consent and overt evidence of consent. And the reason why you have those additional criteria is because people in trauma situations can have chronic or even collapsed immobility responses, which are related to what we colloquially refer to as the freeze response. People kind of go in within themselves. They don't object overtly. They don't say no. They may even give some minimal evidence of what appears to be consent, such as smiling or laughing, but that could just be a sign of nervousness rather than of actual consent. So to ensure that a person is freely consenting and not just engaged in a trauma response, you have to take the extra step of ensuring that they've enthusiastically consented and that it continues throughout the sexual encounter. So you have to have all three of those things, ability to consent, enthusiastic and ongoing for a sexual encounter to be consensual rather than non-consensual and thus potential sexual assault. It's important to have that definition at the outset, because then when we go to a passage like Deuteronomy 10, 20, 10 to 13, and we see a woman or a girl, it could be a 15-year-old. The text allows for a 15 or 16-year-old virgin to be kidnapped. Um, what she would potentially experienced with that passage was she was kidnapped, her family potentially was killed, she's witnessed them killed, and then potentially one of the very soldiers who kidnapped her and killed her family now wants to marry her a month later. The question is, could she freely consent in that situation? And I think it's pretty obvious in the kind of trauma that would be inflicted on a person in that situation that they would not have the ability to consent. So it's important then to talk about these issues to understand what consent is in order to consider whether Deuteronomy 20 is protecting people or whether it is allowing for the prospect of people. Sorry, I said Deuteronomy 20, Deuteronomy 21, but whether it allows for the protection of people or rather sets them up potentially to be sexually assaulted. And if you believe this is God's law to govern his society, then the ability to protect people from sexual assault certainly is relevant and matters. That's why I begin with that definition. Now, I knew, having done that, that there are some people going to say, why are you judging the Bible by Canadian law or something like that? This kind of argument for anachronism or cultural naivete or something like that. So what I said was, and I addressed that in the debate, I pointed out, look, whether you're going to talk about this issue of sexual consent or another thing I've talked a lot about, which is war and genocide, you need to have a definition at play. And you can recognize that people of that time may not have accepted or been familiar with that definition, but that doesn't mean the definition is false unless you're like a moral relativist. It simply means maybe they didn't have the definition, but that doesn't mean it's not consent or sexual assault if you believe the definition is correct. So, with that in mind, I got one of the predictable responses from this fellow named Tim. And let's take a look at that response, and then I'll explain why I think it's so dangerous. Okay, so Tim says, I was born in Nigeria and do work in Chad, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda. I can promise you, mentalities about male female relationships, war survivorship, and spouse selection are completely foreign to Western sensibilities. That Randall uses Canadian law as the launchpad to understand the Bible is jaw droppingly ignorant. First world problems have no intersection with third world responsibilities. I imagine it's much the same for ancient Near Eastern sensibilities. Okay, he goes on then, and I'm not going to read it, but then he goes on and tells, well, there is a story that he's heard in Africa about a woman who was raped and then ended up marrying her rapist and raising a child with the rapist, and everybody was happy. And this shows how Africans have different perspectives on war and violence and rape and sexual consent than do people in the West. And so that's the gist of Tim's argument. But his main thing is here is claim I'm jaw-droppingly ignorant because I'm judging Nigerian or I'm judging all the other societies like the ancient Near East and potentially modern Africa by Western standards of sexual consent, and how dare I do that? Here's why this is so dangerous as a comment. The first thing is this appears to be an overtly moral relativist position. Because this fellow Tim could say the same thing to the British colonialists who came into to India in the 19th century and stopped the practice of sati or a burning of widows. So within Indian society at the time in the 19th century, it was common for widows, when their husbands died, that they were required to climb onto the funeral pyre, the burning corpse of their husband, and to be burned alive with their husband. And that just shows that Indian society had different standards about marital relationships than the British do. But how dare the British impose their standards upon the Indians? And that is precisely the logic that Tim is presenting here when he calls me jaw-droppingly ignorant for saying, how dare I impose my understanding of sexual consent upon the ancient Near East and Israelite society. So flatly, culturally relativistic. It's not, he's claiming I'm naive. No, he's a cultural relativist at this point. You have to have a concept of consent if you're going to talk about whether there is sexual assault in the Bible. If Tim wants to argue that the definition I gave, which is the standard definition in North American law, if that's wrong, then he has to say either, well, it doesn't matter whether the person has the ability to consent, or it doesn't matter whether the person enthusiastically or in an ongoing way expresses consent. Who cares about that? But what that simply shows is, I think, a grave ignorance for the very fact that these understandings of the psychology of trauma undergird and power dynamics undergird the definition of consent as we have it today. And what makes this so dangerous when people like Tim say stuff like this is that what he's saying then is that when a 15-year-old who is sexually assaulted by a clergy member in her church seeks redress for that, Tim can say, well, this is just a different understanding of sexual consent. How dare you impose on the clergy member your standard of sexual consent? And it's these kinds of attitudes that have normalized clergy sexual abuse in North American churches. So it is exactly for this reason that we need to have a clear definition of consent, understand that sexual consent is deeply impacted by power dynamics, and also then by trauma responses. And so you need to ensure the person has the ability to consent, and there are not power relationships operative there that could undermine their ability to consent. And then you need to ensure there's no trauma there, which could undermine their ability to consent by identifying consent as indeed being expressed in an overt way, um, enthusiastically, and throughout the entirety of the sexual encounter. So that is my initial response to that. I thought that was, first of all, a jaw-dropping cultural relativism, since he likes the term jaw-dropping. And I think it's also very dangerous because it entrenches attitudes towards sexual consent, which are very dangerous.